Welcome, everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, webinar producer with CGLR. Connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media. On Facebook, like the page Campaign for GLR. On Twitter, follow the account at Reading by Third. And on LinkedIn, subscribe to us at Campaign for GLR. Please use the hashtag Learning Tuesdays and tag us to tweet anything you learn from today's webinar, and we'll be sure to retweet. We encourage you to share your questions, reflections, and observations on social media. And before we begin, I have just a few housekeeping details. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself, so please use the chat box at the bottom of the screen to share your name, city or state, and your organization. Be sure when responding to select both panelists and attendees so that we all know who is here. All resources, slides, and bios will be shared in a follow-up email to all registrants. And the webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook. That recording will be sent to you as well. Additionally, we'll be posting a brief on-screen evaluation during closing and highly encourage you to respond. This helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement. I also wanted to flag for everyone that should you need closed captions, you're able to turn them on at the bottom of your Zoom doc. That'll be an option for you should you choose to turn it on. And before we start, I wanted to call your attention to our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars. Later this afternoon at 3 p.m., we have an exciting conversation based on the first month of school and beyond, nurturing attendance every day. Next week on October 24th, we have a session on building parent power, fostering a movement of informed learning agents. And on October 31st, before you go trick-or-treating with your kids, join us for Making Money Matter. That'll be at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Information and registration for these links will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. And joining you now is Sarah Torian, Chief Learning and Engagement Officer with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Thanks so much, Sierra, and welcome everyone. I'm so glad that you could all join us for today's Funder to Funder conversation as we explore strategies for empowering families as true partners in efforts to boost student achievement and attendance. Over the past few weeks, GLR Learning Tuesdays webinars have been looking at recent student achievement data, showing that the pace of learning recovery largely stalled over the past school year. And later on this afternoon, we'll be hosting a session in partnership with Attendance Works that shines a light on the incredible increases in chronic absenteeism that we've been seeing across the nation. As we work to respond to the challenges reflected in both of these data points, the Campaign for Grade Level Reading is trying to lift up innovations, strategies, programs, and models that are helping communities to beat those national trends. And as we look for places that are beating those trends, we frequently find that effective family engagement is a critical part of their success. Now, there is a significant amount of federal funding available through ESSA to support family engagement in schools, but all too often we find that some of those funds are used or are not used to support efforts that are really effective at engaging families as partners in their child's learning and success. And that is where philanthropy can play a vital role. Philanthropy can work to identify and promote what works so that schools, families, and most importantly, students can benefit from these effective programs. And that's at the heart of today's conversation. Philanthropy, investing in and lifting up research on what works, and then promoting examples of effective solutions to family engagement. So today's conversation will be broken into kind of three sections. First, we're going to hear from two funders who will discuss what they are doing to promote those positive family-school partnerships and what they're learning through those efforts. Then we'll get to see some hot off the press new research that underscores the importance of supporting strong family engagement. And then we'll get a chance to hear about a range of family engagement models that work, that help teachers, schools, and districts build those strong, positive relationships with families. And to guide us through that conversation, I am delighted to welcome and introduce Yoli Flores as our moderator. Yoli serves as the president and CEO of Families in Schools, a nonprofit organization based in California that works to involve families and communities in their children's education to achieve lifelong success. Previously, she supported the Campaign for Grade Level Reading in elevating parent success as a critical part of our efforts to promote early school success for children from economically challenged families. She is the perfect person to facilitate and moderate today's conversation, and I'm delighted to welcome her and pass the mic over to her. Yoli?
Hello, Sarah, and thank you so much for inviting me to be with you all. My favorite place is always at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. So thank you. It's such a pleasure to be serving as today's moderator in today's Funder to Funder webinar series. Thank you to all of you who have joined us on Zoom and those that are with us streaming on Facebook. So we're excited to have you. As most of you know, if you've been participating in GLR Learning Tuesday webinars, this is not the first time we've explored the topic of family engagement and the power of homeschool partnerships. In fact, many of you have heard the campaign reference the 50 years of research that conveys the positive impact of these partnerships on school achievement, on attendance, and so much more. And from time to time, you've listened to speakers across the country share their best practices, tools, resources, and so much more. The work of families is central to all of what we do. And certainly the campaign centers family success, parent success as core to its mission. So although lots has been shared with you over the years on family engagement, you may be asking, well, what is new today? Well, actually quite a bit, as Sarah has shared. We'll hear from philanthropy. We've got an exciting study and data and really some very impressive new research. The findings you will see are pretty persuasive. You will want to invest in family engagement after you hear these findings. And then, of course, two of our colleagues that will share their family engagement models and how those are translating into the impact that family engagement can have. So we have a lot to share, and we're going to get started. So first, I'm going to invite our funder partners, our philanthropic leaders, Ambika Kapoor and Stephanie Sharp. Let me tell you a little bit about each of them. Ambika Kapoor is a program director within Carnegie Corporation's education program, where she manages the public understanding portfolio. Ambika oversees grant making aimed at engaging parents, communities, teachers, and policymakers in understanding and demanding changes in education that ensure that all students develop the knowledge, skills, and dispositions they need for future success. And Stephanie, welcome, Stephanie. Stephanie Sharp is the portfolio manager and supports organizations in the early impact portfolio, portfolio manager at Overdeck, supporting organizations in the early impact portfolio with a focus on increasing the likelihood that all children enter kindergarten ready to learn and experience early school success, drawing on her experience teaching pre-K in Baltimore City public schools and at two edtech companies. You can read more about each of them in the detailed bios that are posted in the links in the chat box. All right, so Ambika and Stephanie, it's so wonderful to be on the screen with you today. Let's set the stage for today's conversation and maybe start talking about why each of your foundations have made the decision. Actually, you've made them a long time ago because we all know that you are the leaders in family engagement and philanthropy. But why? Tell us what it is about family engagement that has centered your investments into supporting the work in this space. And Ambika, do you want to get us started?
Sure. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Yoli, for your introduction and, this important question. When you actually said the leaders in family engagement, I wouldn't say we are. We've been on this sort of learning journey as well. And it's an important sort of priority for us, but we hope others will join us in this endeavor. But just as, to answer your question, at Carnegie Corporation, our family engagement work sits in our public understanding portfolio, which focuses on fostering collaboration among everyone who has a stake in student success. And that is, we say, parents, educators, students, and community leaders. We at the foundation have this belief that when parents are empowered as true partners in their children's education, students thrive, schools are stronger, and the whole community benefits. And, Yoli referred to this too. Research has made that clear over the years. We know that. But despite the research, family engagement strategies have not been widely adopted by schools and school districts. So this is something that we as a foundation believe that we need to still sort of encourage. We at the foundation began prioritizing family and community engagement about 8 years ago. And it was really as a way to ensure stakeholder voice was represented in the education landscape. We had sort of learned from some of the lessons of our investments in the standards and assessments work, especially the battle with the Common Core and how we as a field didn't do a great job in stakeholder engagement. We had learned the hard way that we should, we really, whatever investments we sort of make in education, we really need to think about the stakeholders, families, students, and communities, and their voices and input before we invest in new strategies. So that's really our impetus on how we got into this work. And like I said, we've been on this learning journey, learning from the grantees and other investments in the field. So I'll stop there and give Stephanie a chance.
Thank you, Ambika. Stephanie, jump on in. Tell us about the why for Overdeck on family engagement.
Sure. And yeah, thank you, Yoli and Ambika. Thank you for also saying that you had that pit in your stomach when Yoli said leaders. I felt the same way. I was like, oh my gosh, we are similarly learning so much here. But what I will say is,
Stephanie, let me stop you. There's an echo coming.
Oh.
From your sound.
Oh no.
Yeah. Some of our friends in the chat are also having a difficult time hearing. Okay, hang on, folks. We'll get this. We did do a test and it was fine. But this is what happens with our wonderful technology. All right, let's try this, Stephanie.
No, it still doesn't work.
Oh, perfect. Yes. Now.
Okay, great. Glad. Sorry for that. But I was just saying that it's hard for us to feel like leaders in this work too. I think we're very much learning. From Overdeck Family Foundation's perspective, and as a funder, we are laser focused on measurably improving academic and social emotional outcomes, both inside and outside of the classroom. And so I know we've all said this, that research really proves that family engagement measurably improves outcomes, but just to spell that out, it improves attendance, better grades, better test scores, fewer special education placements, better graduation rates, greater enrollment in post-secondary education. There's even studies that show that caregiver involvement at home has more than twice the effect on student test scores than caregiver education level or socioeconomic status. So the research is just incredibly compelling when you are laser focused on measurably improving outcomes. And then on top of that, some of us are former teachers, some of us are parents, all of us have been students or are students, maybe even still today, and just can attest to the importance of relationships to learning. It's almost impossible to be a human and remove that aspect of your educational journey. And then just to put the sort of icing on the cake on all of this, what we're learning is that family engagement efforts can actually be quite cost effective. So from philanthropy's perspective, or at least our perspective, when we think about how great the problems are and how much is needed to really address them at scale, family engagement becomes quite a compelling case.
Right. So the evidence is clear, and we know the power of listening to families, to students, to community, to the very people that often have the solutions to the problems that we think we can solve. They're both very powerful ways of stepping into this work and knowing why we're in this work. So as you have been investing in family engagement and supporting effective models across the country, what have you learned from these investments? You both said you are both learners. I still think you are both also leaders. But what is the evidence that you're talking about in terms of effective practices that drive outcomes? What are the actual practices that get us to the results that we're seeing? You want to kick us off, Stephanie, this time?
Sure. One of the things that we have been looking at in our grant making is when we think about our family engagement work, we think about it maybe in two different buckets, sort of this parents as partners, really effectively collaborating with school environments, having that two partnership engagement, or parents as teachers. How do we share information with parents at home so that they can, deliver instruction in some shape or form? And those, that's maybe a false dichotomy. There are many things that sort of blend the two. But if we think about it that way, I think one thing that has been very compelling is that a strong relationship is maybe enough to drive student outcomes on attendance, on literacy, on math, on all of these really mission critical outcomes. It is actually enough to just have a strong bond between a teacher and a parent. So that's one thing that I'll say. I think another thing that we're learning is that this is maybe very naive, but when I started in this work, I felt that, how can you scale relationships? That kind of practice feels just so teacher driven, like you have that magical teacher who is able to create that type of environment. And actually, there is a lot of low hanging fruit here, really repeatable, scalable practices that can be embedded in classrooms in a scalable way that all of a sudden makes this work feel much more replicable. So I'm talking about things like translating in home languages for families. Tech makes that much, much easier today than it was before. But when we talk about family engagement, relationships are critical, but it's not necessarily something that is person driven, if that makes sense.
Yep, makes a lot of sense. Ambika, your thoughts on what we're learning, particularly around effective practices?
Yeah, I actually agree with a lot of what Stephanie said. For us, like I said, we began this work, about 8 years ago, and the learnings from our investments, what we've done a lot was sort of around, field building, looking at, we did some analysis around field building and even to sort of look at refining our grant making to have a greater impact. I mean, that's the sort of learning stance that we took. We conducted, for example, a funding landscape analysis of in the field of family engagement. We looked at, the work geographically and by issue. We've also done a self-review of our grant making. We have even commissioned several reports on family engagement best practices. And we also participate in several funder working groups, and Overdeck and Carnegie are part of our group together, and we share best practices. So I think that's sort of the stance that we've taken. And through this work, I think we found there are some gaps and opportunities in which the corporation can play a role given the limited dollars we have. And I take this approach because I agree with everything that Stephanie has said about learning from investments and what the field needs. But as a funder, with limited dollars, we were trying to sort of see what are some areas that can have an outsized influence given the landscape. So we've learned three things, and based on those three things, that's how we've been thinking about our investment strategies. The first is opportunities. We invest in opportunities in which schools and families, or teachers and parents, can partner around student success. And that's that relationship building that Stephanie just talked about. And what we mean by student success is math, literacy, science, mental well-being, and even access to post-secondary options. So that relationship building or that partnership leads to success for students and in these areas. Second, we also feel what we've seen and learned that families and community members can be supported through leadership and advocacy, to have a seat at the table, to have their voices heard, and to participate in the education system. So it's sort of not having, reforms or education initiatives done to families. They're part of the process as well. And third, I would say, the importance of family and community members or stakeholders, I would say, to have the information they need to make informed decisions and choices to navigate the school system. It's sort of, where do families get the information they need to make decisions about helping their kids navigate not just the school system, but even or grade level progression, but even the whole school system. And just for us as a focus, this is really, I should sort of say this out loud, is that our priority is to really reach low income, traditionally underserved families as part of our grant making efforts. A lot of the family engagement practices happen in many of the schools that are well endowed, but most of the families that we have been sort of our grantees working with, we see sort of this big gap.
Thanks, Ambika. You mentioned very briefly sort of having done a landscape analysis in philanthropy. What's your sense of where in general philanthropy is in investing in family engagement? Is it shifting? Is it moving? Do we need what do we need to get even more folks really centered in the investment of family engagement models?
So when, we did this landscape analysis when we first got into this work, because we had never invested in sort of family engagement as an instructional strategy. And about 8 years ago, we've learned that a lot of funders were interested in family engagement, but there were gaps. They were sort of, it was about issues. If you were a funder that, wanted to get families to buy into something that you supported, whether it was instruction materials or school choice, you supported efforts around those particular areas. So there was a gap in sort of like meeting families where they're at, or listening to what their needs might be, and then thinking about sort of investment strategies. We did this, the pandemic sort of laid bare how important family engagement was. I mean, we learned the hard way that when schools shut down, families were front and center and got a peek into their children's education like never before. So we felt, well, that this is a time to sort of see all the efforts that we have been doing around field building. Did that make a difference? So we partnered with CPRL, the Center for Public Research and Leadership at Columbia University, to do another look at the field. And there are still gaps in the field. There is, they sort of did this analysis that the field is still forming. Funders are very interested in family engagement, but there is a gap in how they're thinking about, or in the dollars that are going into this work. Even as recently as last week, the Grantmakers for Education had their annual conference, and they do this annual survey as part of the conference. It's the Trends in Education Philanthropy report. And according to that report, 60% of education funders said they funded in family, were interested in funding in family engagement efforts. However, the funding actually only accounts for 8% of overall education support. So there is still a big gap there.
Yeah, I would call it a huge gap.
Yes, a huge
and
gap.
And I think that you know, the voice that you bring to this with your peers, but also the kind of information, for example, that you'll hear today, we hope will spark even greater interest and begin to reduce that gap. Because I know our communities, our families see the value of fostering those powerful relationships that Stephanie talked about between the parent, the teacher, the parent, the school, the home, and the school. So we'll absolutely hope that that gap begins to close as we go deeper into the impact and know that the research supports this work so tremendously. So let's shift now a little bit. And Ambika, you mentioned what happened during the pandemic and how so much laid bare in what was happening inside and outside of schools. So in terms of family engagement, what do you think has shifted during the pandemic, either interest or demand for effective family engagement strategies or new innovation approaches? Did you see a shift? Did you see folks thinking differently about the role families play in the lives of their children? So share your thoughts during that very difficult time, but also a time where we got to see just the importance of the role families play. Stephanie, you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, we definitely saw a shift. I would say almost all of our family engagement grantees increased their reach really dramatically. We saw incredible demand. It was, you know, maybe one of the few silver linings of the pandemic that way. I think what has been interesting and like really where I see an opportunity looking forward as we like the demand hasn't gone away. It is still there. It's not slowing. But what is interesting and maybe missing is we're still out here, and I think this is true from our conversations with other funders, from grantees conversations with district partners, still making the case for family engagement's connection to academic outcomes and attendance. People know that they need to engage families, that is important, that relationships are key, but they maybe don't always connect that to the bottom line for schools and those incredibly important performance indicators for kids. And so that feels like one true opportunity moving forward to really capitalize on the demand that exists now and really transform this into, you know, family engagement looks like muffins for moms and donuts for dads. I really hope we can move beyond those types of events into, you know, if you care about tutoring, you de facto have to care about family engagement because a high quality tutoring program is only going to be so great if families know that it's there and are excited about enrolling their kids. So that to me is like the next step. We got the demand from COVID. Now, how can we translate that into something really sticky and meaningful?
And Dr. Karen Mapp reminds us all of the time that family engagement is a strategy for student success. It's not in and of itself what we may think is the end. It's not. It's really how powerful it is in moving forward our students in their education. Ambika, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd actually agree with everything that Stephanie said. I mean, you know, the pandemic did highlight, I mean, that was the silver lining. We all sort of said that a lot, and we heard that from a lot of, you know, school districts, all the stakeholders, even funders. But how that actually plays out after, as you know, I always sort of quote Dr. Karen Mapp, who says family engagement shouldn't be a nice to have, and that's how, you know, school districts have sort of seen it. But to sort of see the importance of it as an instructional strategy or to improve student success, and has, you know, like we talked about, academic as well as sort of mental health and well-being being, to sort of see it as a holistic approach. That is something that we see that the field is not there yet. So one of the things that I would say, encourage since we're sort of talking about, the funder perspective, I feel that the case that we make internally, even at the foundation, is that we could be funding innovations in education in so many ways, as whether it's high quality instruction materials. We talk about having instruction materials in math and science, for example, or literacy. That is going to help students succeed. But we need to really think about how families are engaged too, because that actually helps with student achievement as well. But also, in another way, is to think about those investments as sort of the innovations or the supply side that we as funders might be funding, but also think about the demand side. How do we bring families into or build demand for these investments that we make? So if there are two ways to think about it, as the instruction piece, as even Steph talked about, and also as the demand side. So when we fund supply side innovations, we need to really think about the demand side too. So that's another way that I think the field can, or funders can, think about investments in family engagement. And that is something that we have not done as much.
Really great guidance and advice for our funder partners who are joining us today. Both of you, thank you for sharing your thoughts. You have so perfectly provided the lead into our next speaker, as we've been talking about before the pandemic, during the pandemic, after the pandemic. So I'm going to thank you for your remarks and invite Dr. Eyal Bergman to join us. And you guys stay near, because I'm going to bring you back in a little bit. But let me introduce you to my friend Eyal, who is going to knock your socks off in just a moment. But let me introduce Dr. Bergman. Eyal Bergman serves as the Senior Vice President at Learning Heroes, where he conducts research on the relationship between home and school and leads training programs that support school and district leaders in strengthening their family engagement strategies. Previously, he was the founder and director of the Family and Community Engagement Office in the Cajon Valley Union School District, that's in California, and his professional roots are in community organizing and youth mentoring. Eyal obtained his doctorate of education leadership from Harvard, where he had the great privilege of collaborating with the one and only Dr. Karen Mapp on several publications, including the second version of the dual capacity building framework for family school partnerships, which for many of us is our Bible. More detailed information on his bio and his background is posted in the chat box via a link. So Eyal, come on in. Where are you?
Hi, Yoli. Good to see you.
So wonderful to see you again. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited about the conversation we're about to have with you. Before we jump in, I understand that Learning Heroes and TNTP have been collaborating on a study. So you've been hearing me play it up because I got a sneak preview last week on a study to understand the effects of pre-pandemic family engagement on current school outcomes. And I know that Dr. Mapp and Todd Rogers at Harvard are some of your advisors. So before we get into what you've learned from this study, can you share a little bit about how this study came about? So give us some context. So step back, give some context. And where are you in the process? And then we'll get to the nitty-gritty details.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me here, Yoli. Thank you for that kind introduction. I mean, I think when the pandemic started, I think it became clear to many of us that the schools that had stronger relationships with families would be a little bit better equipped to withstand those massive disruptions in schooling. And you mentioned Karen Mapp. At the time, she was on my doctoral committee, and At the time, also, we were writing a piece about what we've learned from the pandemic, a piece about liberatory family engagement, which, thanks to Ambika and her colleagues, was published by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. And in all of those conversations, we talked a lot about how the pandemic would be a very important time to study the effects of family engagement and to essentially test that hypothesis. The question being, were schools that had stronger family engagement before the pandemic actually better equipped to withstand the impact of school closures? And, flash forward a little bit, she mentioned this on a Learning Heroes webinar, and we attracted some funder interest. And so thanks to the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, we were able to fund a planning phase and the first of 3 total phases of the study. And in particular, we were able to bring on our fabulous research partner, TNTP, to help us conduct the study. So where we are now is that we now have the data from that initial first phase, which has been a quantitative analysis using statewide data in Illinois. And I mean, you've been referencing it. Honestly, we've been pretty stunned by the strength of the findings. I'm pretty excited to share. But before we get into it, I will say that the second phase is meant to be a qualitative body of work across schools in Illinois to help us really understand a little bit better what we uncovered from the quantitative data in phase 1. And in the third phase, we'd like to be able to create a measurement tool that helps schools better assess themselves according to what we know actually makes a difference for improving family engagement over time. This is something that is pretty sorely needed in the field. And Ambika referenced the idea that the field is still forming. So that means we need better measurement tools to help the field really start to form better.
Perfect. Great as background. Just 2 quick questions before we get to your very persuasive slides. Why Illinois? Why not California, where I am? Why Illinois? And can you say a little bit about the 5 essentials? Because I know that they played a key role here.
Well, unfortunately, there's just not that many great sources of data on the strength of a school's family engagement efforts. It's one of the problems we're trying to address. And I would love to address it in California if we can. So parent surveys could be valuable, except for, as most folks on this call know, the response rates tend to not be very good. And the pool of respondents tend to not be very representative of the full group that they purport to assess. In Illinois, the 5 Essentials Teacher Survey has been administered statewide in all schools in Illinois for over 10 years. And it measures not just family engagement, it measures 5 foundational supports, one of which is this involved families metric, which measures the extent to which a school staff feel that they develop strong relationships with families. So it's a teacher survey, and it's been really validated through rigorous longitudinal research by the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research. It has an average response rate over 80%. That's really good. So no one survey is perfect. I mentioned a little bit ago that we had a planning phase to this study, and in that planning phase, we interviewed about nearly 20 family engagement leaders, researchers, and practitioners. And over again, this measure was the one that came up as the best one to do a big comprehensive study. And the last thing I'll say is, Illinois is actually if you're going to choose one state, it's a good state to choose because it's pretty representative of the country as a whole in terms of race, in terms of income, in terms of percentages of rural, suburban, and urban. So again, one data source is not going to tell you everything, but this one data source really does tell us a lot.
Got it. Okay. I'll eventually bring you to California on that. Let's talk about the data. So you've been in the planning phase, you've done some important work already, you have some powerful information to share. Let's bring up your slides and walk us through what you've learned.
Okay. So I'm pretty excited, I have to say, because you're all getting the first sort of sneak peek. This is the first time that we're sharing this data. So first, just a word about the methodology, the quantitative analysis. We use statistics to be able to try to isolate the family engagement score as a predictive element of different outcomes. And so I think one way to help us understand the value of statistics is that, there's a lot of different pieces of the pie. Stephanie was talking about this earlier. There's a lot of explanations about why we see certain test scores or why we see certain absenteeism rates. And so statistics, if it's done well, help us isolate some variables and understand how big the different pieces of the pie really are. And so I'll say here too that my wonderful colleague at TNTP, Adam Meyer, is on the call. So if folks do have questions about the methodology or specific findings that I'm not able to address while I'm speaking, Adam is here to be able to answer them in the Q&A. So to make it simple, here's what the stats let us do. Okay, if you consider 2 schools and you say, and you're able to control for a whole host of variables, and we have over a dozen variables in our model because there's a lot of data that's publicly available. And you can assume that given the model, we're able to say that 2 schools that are, for all intents and purposes, the same. So they had the same outcomes pre-pandemic. So it's not like one school started here and one school started here. They had the same outcomes. They had the same proportion of low-income students. They're the same grade level. So you're not comparing elementary to high school. And the same type of community, rural, suburban, and urban. So for all intents and purposes, all of the available data that we can measure, they are essentially the same, except for their family engagement score on the 5 essentials. And so in this case, the way I'm going to present the data, if you imagine that the orange school is in the 10th percentile, so it is one of the weakest family engagement scores, and you compare it to the blue school, which is in the 90th percentile, so one of the strongest performing family engagement scores, the question then becomes, once all else being equal, and we just look at the family engagement score, pre-pandemic, and we looked at 2019 because that's the last full year before the pandemic, how were their outcomes different? That's our big question. Well,
Drum roll.
We know that chronic absenteeism has shot up around the country and it has stayed up. What we see is that the increase for schools that had very strong family engagement is 39% smaller than it was for schools that had weak family engagement. And the attendance rate, I'm choked up, this is important, is 25% better. These are pretty significant findings. And I'm going to put this into real terms. If you put that into real children in a school of 500 kids, an average school of 500 kids, that's 31 children that are not chronically absent. In a school of 1,000, that's 62 children that are not chronically absent. That's multiple classrooms. It could be a whole grade level in a school. That's very significant. In terms of attendance, that's 800 fewer student absences in a year for a school of 500. And now, Yoli, you said we're from California?
Yes.
States like ours, schools get funded based on something called average daily attendance. In other words, they get their money based on how many kids show up to school. So butts in seats. Mm-hmm. In states like that, it equates to about $45,000 for a school of 500, 90,000 for a school of 1,000. That's real money. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if folks know this, but when I was in the district, the attendance office was under the fiscal services department. And there's a reason for that. Okay, I'm going to keep moving.
Keep moving.
In our model, in our statistical model, we also saw effects on ELA and math performance. So again, 2022 rates went down across the board. We know that. In schools that pre-pandemic had strong family engagement, our model showed a decline that was 27% less than weak engagement schools in ELA, and 37% less in schools on math proficiency. In ELA, that's 11 kids in a 500 kid school and 14 kids in a 500 kid school. So these are real kids, real numbers. Now, if you remember, we're looking at 2019 family engagement scores to 2022 outcomes. And remember, in between there was a year where there was a lot of variability in terms of whether kids were in person or remote. That was the 2020, 2021 year. And we know from a lot of research that the number of in-person learning days had a big influence in 2020, 2021, had a big influence on 2022 test scores.
Right.
Right. So we know from data that in Illinois, in that year, the 2020, 2021 school year, the average school had about 50 in-person learning days and out of the 180 total instructional days. So to give you a sense of what that 27% improvement in ELA and the 37% improvement in math, that equates to about 100 in-person learning days over the course of that year. Okay.
So more kids learning, fewer kids absent.
It's really hard to move test scores. The chronic absenteeism to me is the most compelling finding here, if I'm being totally honest. So the University of Chicago Consortium on School Research and others have shown this association between family engagement scores and outcomes before. So it's not totally brand new. So then the question becomes like, what is actually new here? What is the magnitude of the pandemic? So we wanted to ask that question. So just to give you a sense, again, that 39% is the difference between a 15.9% increase in weak family engagement schools, and 9.7% increase in strong engagement. Again, everybody went up, but that 6% is like the difference between having a chronic absenteeism rate that's 21% and a chronic absenteeism rate that's 15%. And show me a school that wouldn't rather be at 15 than 21. So that's the effect of strong pre-pandemic family engagement. But we wanted to see what was the effect even before the pandemic. So we looked at data comparing 2018 family engagement to 2019 chronic absence so that we could do a more apples to apples comparison. And what we see is that the magnitude is about half, right? So the impact of 2018 family engagement on 2019 family engagement chronic absence is half of the impact that we see given the influence of the pandemic. So that is really significant. And to me, the takeaway is it mattered before, it really matters now. And if you ask me, where we are now in this country with chronic absenteeism, my hypothesis is that the next couple of years are going to look a lot more like 2022 than they are what we looked like in 2018 and 2019. So finally, the last slide I want to show is that this finding held true for schools across the board. So you see that we've been working with that 6.2% number for chronic absence at the top. That's all schools. Look at the very bottom. The effect size was highest for rural and urban schools. The effects held for elementary, middle, and high, and actually was highest for middle school. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a moment, see if there's any, I don't know, this is now your second look at the data, Yoli. If there's any questions or comments that you'd like to share before I share about the next phases of our study.
Yeah, well, first of all, this is a wow deck and a wow presentation. And as you said, we have known, given the reference we've made before about the 50 years of research on family engagement, just how important and the impact that it has. But your data, I think, is telling us the magnitude of that impact, especially after this very difficult school closure period and where we are today with the numbers out of just crazy chronic absence numbers across almost every school in every community across this country. And I guess, part of the question that I might have, and maybe we can explore this, and I'm sure this might show up in the chat, is that if we know the magnitude and the powerful impact of family engagement to reverse and to move us back toward, I hope we'll never even be where we were pre-pandemic on chronic absence, because it was already a problem. And we know that chronic absence impacts learning. If you're not in the seat, you're not going to learn. So, the question is, how do we use this data to be even more compelling? Yes, for investment purposes, but also for how we communicate the importance of family engagement to families, to schools, to communities. The power that it brings in terms of student success. I mean, I think that's at the core of what we want to accomplish here.
Yeah, agreed. We want to see, as Ambika and Stephanie were sharing earlier, we want to see more investments, but smarter investments too. We know what works. You're going to hear from talking points, and you're going to hear from parent-teacher home visits, and I'm going to share a little bit about the work that we do training leaders in a little bit too. There are resources available. I think that a lot of times, and this is something that Dr. Mepp and I write about in the piece that Carnegie published, was that a lot of folks, they don't necessarily have a clear notion of how to invest. They might not necessarily have the mental models for what really compelling, really good solidarity-driven family engagement actually looks like. So this data can help us tell some of that story. And I think that this may be a point for me to share also what we have coming up, so I can round out, because there are limitations to every data, right? In some ways, the quantitative analysis is really helpful because it helps us really uncover what is this association between family engagement and student outcomes, but it doesn't necessarily tell us why schools were stronger at family engagement or not. So that's part of what we have planned. So I'm going to share my screen again. So again, we started with the first stage, which is establishing the case and doing this quantitative analysis. But like I said, all studies have their limitations. So what we want to do next, in the second stage of this study, is to use rigorous qualitative methods to conduct focus groups and in-depth interviews with families, with teachers, with principals, with district leaders, and with community members in a large cross-section of schools across Illinois, including rural, suburban, urban areas, schools that performed well and schools that didn't, so that we can have a really robust sample to really uncover what were they doing? Like, what were the policies? What were the practices? What were the mindsets? What were the leadership moves that enabled either a stronger than expected family engagement score or a weaker than expected family engagement score? And, I will say, we all have our hypotheses. You have your hypotheses. You've been doing this work for a long time, Yoli. A lot of us have our hypotheses about what might explain some of these scores. But I also think we need to stay curious. And I think that I feel very confident that if we are able to conduct this qualitative body of work, that we are going to learn a lot, and that we are going to be able to paint a more complete picture that has started to get drawn out by what we found in this first stage of data.
That's right.
So we're actively fundraising for this. And if we are able to fundraise above this threshold, then we may be able to conduct additional analyses in additional states. So I'll just round out by sharing a little bit about the third stage.
Yes.
Is that all right?
Yep, and then I gotta move us, but because I want to say one thing before I bring the next set of folks on, but tell me about the stage 3 piece, because I think it's pretty essential.
Sure. Well, so stages 1 and 2 are a retrospective look. They are looking back at what we've learned from the pandemic. Stage 3 is a prospective body of work. It looks towards the future. And I think it addresses a really, like I said earlier, a really critical need in the field. The field does not currently have a really strong, reliable, and valid measurement tool to help schools know whether they are making progress on their family engagement strategy. So we would like to develop and test a tool that can be used by educators, that can be used by policymakers, and that can be used by researchers, so we can help schools measure themselves better, and so that we can help them know where to point their arrow. So we welcome partnership. We are looking for funding to support this body of work, but we're also looking for places that would want to help us test the beta of this tool. So I think I'll pause there and I'll just leave my contact information here. So if anybody has questions about the data or what we're planning, please don't hesitate to be in touch.
Thank you, Eyal. This is super, super important and forward-looking. I'm excited for so many reasons, especially one of the last points that you made, which will be the lead into inviting our colleagues that are doing such important work at the local level around family engagement and have model family engagement programs. But what you said is, what were these schools doing specifically that moved the needle in such a dramatic fashion? Having been a school board member in my past and doing work statewide in California, it is the one thing that district leaders continue to ask. Many of them are compelled already by the data, but by what they learned during the pandemic, but aren't quite sure, what does it really look like? What does real, authentic, and impactful, results-driven family engagement look like? Where do we start? Where do we go from here? And the one thing I don't want any school to go back to is a compliance-oriented approach to just check off the box that they did family engagement, provided another training, and it doesn't get at the core, which Ambika and Steph talked about earlier. That at the core, it's about relationship building. And that requires mindset shifts. And that requires us to do our work differently in community. So lots to learn. I am curious too, even for those of us who have been in this work for a long time are still learning. You got to get this funding. You got to complete the work. So let me bring our two colleagues. We've had them on this platform before at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading GLR Learning Tuesdays, who are exemplars in the field of family engagement. So Gina Martinez-Ketty and Kate Pechasek, I'm going to introduce each of you and then invite you to come on. Gina Martinez-Ketty is and has been the executive director of Parent-Teacher Home Visits since 2017. She too was a community organizer who worked to launch PTHV, Parent-Teacher Home Visits, in Sacramento, California. She continued her organizing career serving as the executive director of Congregations Organizing for Renewal and Orange County Congregation Community Organizations, and at PICO National Network as director of professional development and a statewide consultant. So welcome, Gina. Can't wait to have the conversation with you. And Kate Pechasek currently serves as the head of impact strategy at Talking Points, where she applies her deep expertise in teaching and educational technology. Kate taught in the classroom for 15 years and served as a district leader for 10 years in districts across the country before transitioning to a focus on ed tech. So welcome, Gina, and welcome, Kate and Eyal. You're going to hang in there with us because you're going to be part of this conversation. So let's get started. Gina and then Kate. For those in attendance today who may not be familiar with your organizations, the amazing work that you do, please share what your organizations do and how your programs promote strong family school partnerships and improved child outcomes. So Gina, can we start with you and then we'll go over to Kate.
All right, thank you, Yoli. And I just want to say thank you, Eyal and Learning Heroes and TNTP for doing that such compelling research. It helps all of us. So parent-teacher home visits at its core is really all about building those relationships of trust between families and educators. And we do that by providing training to educators on how to use our model of relationship building home visits. So on the next slide, you can see our what we call our five non-negotiable core practices. And this is really the heart of our model. So first of all, visits are always going to be voluntary for families and for educators. Second one is that educators we provide that training for them, and we always want to make sure that their school district compensates home visitors for their home visiting time. And then the third piece of our model is really what I consider the heart and soul of it, because we always ask the educators to ask the question during a home visit, what are your hopes and dreams for your child? And that, as you can imagine, begins to open up a whole different kind of conversation. The fourth one is that the parent-teacher home visit model is really designed to benefit all students, not just the ones that might be struggling, not just the ones that might be thriving, but really all students. And then the fifth one is that educators always go in pairs to home visits, and they take a little bit of time after the home visit to reflect on what they learned during that visit that they can then take back into their teaching practice to better support the student. So let's go to the next slide and take a look at some of the outcomes from this model. So a few years ago, we did some pretty rigorous research on the effects of this model. The research was done, it was a national study, and it was done by RTI International and by Dr. Steve Sheldon from Johns Hopkins University. And some of the key findings were that the home visit model really helped change mindsets between educators and families. So they began to see each other as partners. They began to see each other as co-equal educators in support of that child. It also strengthened relationships. It strengthened ongoing communication, ongoing two-way communication between families and educators. And it increased the confidence in both of them reaching out to each other to check in on things that might be happening at home or at school that might affect learning. And then for student outcomes, the model showed significant decreases in chronic absence rates and significant increases in English language arts proficiency for students that received a home visit. And even beyond that, the research showed that for schools that implemented parent-teacher home visits with at least 10% of their student population, they saw similar decreases in chronic absence and increases in academic achievement at the whole school level. So even for students that did not receive a home visit. So that's a little bit about parent-teacher home visits in a nutshell.
Thank you, Gina. Let's move on to Kate. Tell us about talking points, Kate.
Yeah, absolutely. We are trying to provide a universal family engagement platform. So meaning universally designed. What our goal really isn't to communicate with families in the 400 ways you could. It's to find the one way that every family can access so we can start that relationship building. I have to say in this particular webinar, I have never heard more of a chorus come together, even though we all come from different places and spaces. We're all really reinforcing the messages with each other. So our goal is to measure effective family engagement in only one way, the types of engagement that improve student outcomes. That's it. There isn't any other complication to it. It is absolutely not a nice to have. I've been in education nearly 30 years and always put it in that bucket, to be really honest, from the start of my teaching career. It's one of the most powerful levers we can pull if we care about students and their outcomes. So on the next slide, how do we do this? Universal design, what does it mean? It means eliminating barriers. If you can find a barrier for one family and universally apply a mechanism to eliminate that barrier, it supports all families in better engaging with schools. So those barriers include language and culture barriers. Some of those that we've already heard referenced a little bit, I think Stephanie brought it up in terms of language and translation. Time and availability, huge barriers for nearly every family at this point, and teaching staff and school staff. Socioeconomic challenges, technology access. I think we just heard about capacity and knowledge and mindsets and perceptions. Not the first things you think about. You kind of need to get some of the other barriers out of the way, and then you realize, okay, we've got some more work to do here. So on the next slide, what is this? At its very simplest parts, universal design means the first thing is very unflashy and absolutely essential. Defaulting every family into text message first absolutely is a difference maker when it comes to reaching families. So a school staff member can send a message in English to any one family, all families, one single family member, a whole school, a whole district. That family receives the message via text first in their home language. They can opt into an app, but we start with text. They respond in their home language, and it's received back by the staff in English. That is at its core a difference maker when it comes to family engagement and relationship building, partially because text is informal. It gets rid of that formality of engaging with schools, and it allows family to engage with schools the way they engage with their friends and their family. Then the next slide is just the other part of equity when it comes to a platform. When you're given access to technology, you have the mechanism to create more equitable ways of engaging. So it isn't just, we actually created our own K-12 contextualized translation. That matters. If it's not understandable, it actually doesn't matter that it's translated. And then we actually layer in human translators as well. And then with one click, that's how the request goes in from a staff member or a family member. Say, we need human translation. That information not only gets retranslated, but it feeds back into the machine, making bigger, better, stronger, more understandable translations over time. And then we actually include education terminology in the platform. IEP, there's a really common one you're seeing in the screenshot, thrown around schools left and right all over the place. If you're not a family who's had a student who has been part of a special ed evaluation, you wouldn't know what an IEP is. So including definitions like that and leveling the playing field on that kind of terminology. And then really real-time PD for teachers, the minute they write a message that's above a 5th grade reading level or includes terminology that's difficult to translate, providing guidance right in the moment while they're writing that message is really important. And then things like text-to-speech and speech-to-text allowing further access is key, and it's part of the reason we see results that we'll talk about in a little bit from the use of talking points.
Thank you, Kate. Super powerful way to begin relationship building. It starts with communication and being able to communicate in a way that you understand and can convey in your own language, your concerns, your questions. So excited to share this technology and the work that you do at Talking Points with the folks with us today. Let's go a little bit deeper on each of these models. And Kate, let's keep you going with Talking Points. In this moment where we have seen so much academic learning loss because of the pandemic, and as we've been saying through the hour here, continuing to see high rates of absenteeism in the wake of the pandemic. Tell us a little bit more about how Talking Points is helping schools engage with families and what impact that is having, again, specifically on this issue of attendance.
Yeah, absolutely. If you move to the next slide, let me not bury the lead any longer. And it pairs so nicely with the data that we just heard from Learning Heroes. We have a 5-year longitudinal causal study. So causal is a big deal. It isn't just correlational, it's causal, showing that when you are able to use a universally designed platform to build those relationships, information is shared between families and schools once that trust is built that is essential to removing barriers to learning for students. So when we did that, what we saw is a 7% overall increase in academic outcomes in math and reading course proficiency, and even more for traditionally underserved students. And then a 15% decrease overall in chronic absenteeism. And again, closing of that achievement gap that I will say in my 30 years in education have never seen achievement gap closure like that. So this nice to have that I've always put it in that bucket for years and years until the last few, when I finally learned what so many of you already knew, it's a massively powerful lever. How is it happening? I literally go in our platform sometimes and look at conversations shared between families and schools. You can see the moment the trust is built, and you can see one nugget of important information shared from a teacher to a family member or vice versa, and something is unlocked that allows both parties to better know that student and provide the supports they need in order to improve outcomes. And we simply can't survive in schools anymore without this. We can't do more. We have to be smarter. And the smartest thing we can do is get families and schools to partner to support that student.
Thank you, Kate. I think that was your last slide, yes? So
I think I have one more in a little bit, but yeah, but I think
we'll bring it back. Let's turn to Gina. Gina, if you could also just talk about the places that you've been working, schools and districts. What are you seeing in terms of learning recovery and student attendance?
Yeah, so I think for parent-teacher home visits, and I'm glad Kate talked about it, is that when we talk about, and I wonder if we can stop sharing maybe, or because, yeah, thanks. When we talk about attendance and learning recovery, part of it is getting kids to school or studying harder or whatever it might be, but we believe that there's really something fundamental underlying those things, and that is what we've been talking about in this webinar, and that is trusting relationships. Like that moment that Kate talked about, when you see that trust happen, that is so fundamental to all other kinds of outcomes. So whether it's attendance, whether it's learning, whether it's social emotional wellness, whatever it is, at parent-teacher home visits, we really pay attention to that foundation of trust that, I always say that when you have trust between families and schools, it probably, every other program, every other intervention is probably going to work a whole lot better. So that's kind of where we contribute to the overall picture. And we have seen a lot of school districts across the country kind of adopt that mindset. And so when they began to think about recovery post or during or post pandemic, a lot of them really adopted that mindset of let's pay attention to that fundamental piece of relationship building in their recovery efforts. And so many of them invested their federal COVID relief dollars in home visits, or continued their home visit practice throughout the pandemic, or some of them continued some of the research. We have one school district that did some research that found that even in the throes of the pandemic, that students who received a home visit had significantly, statistically significant increases in attendance compared to students that did not receive a home visit. And so we know that all of that is important. And then just nationally, what we've been seeing is that we did see a dip in home visits at that very first year of the pandemic, but since then we have seen an uptick in home visit practices. We don't yet have our numbers yet for this last school year, but based on what we've seen and heard, we do anticipate a further uptick in the home visit practices as we go forward. And again, based on all the research that we know, we would anticipate then that as these practices continue, that we'll continue to see improvements in attendance and learning.
Great, thank you both for those insights. I know we're running a little bit behind, so let me just quickly turn to Kate. I know she had one more slide, and maybe you can share a little bit about the insights on what you saw with schools that were using your programs before the pandemic. Gina, give us a minute of what you saw, and then we'll turn to Kate because she's got one more slide, and then I want to bring Ayal into the conversation.
Sure. So we almost immediately heard from home visiting educators at the start of the pandemic who told us overwhelmingly that they believed that the relationships that they built before the pandemic hit made all the difference in transitioning to remote learning. And so their kids showed up without as you know, they showed up in the virtual classroom without as much effort as some of their colleagues. And that might have been because they had the right phone number to call or text the family on, or they already had patterns of communication established. And so we've really seen that these relationships of trust can really provide a protective factor as we move through things like the pandemic, but also the many other kinds of challenges that happen in students' lives. And just quickly want to say that we did publish a toolkit around a year ago that talked a lot about that protective factor of relationships as we talk about recovery from the pandemic.
Yeah, Gina, one quick question. How often do the home visits occur for a student?
So our visit is a 2-visit model. Typically, the first visit happens in the summer or the beginning of the school year, and then the second one happens sometime around winter-ish. But what we find is that after the first home visit, that's what really establishes that trust and opens the doors for ongoing communication throughout the year.
Oh my God, that first question, what are your hopes and dreams for your children? Just, if I could snap my fingers, I would snap them all the time. Every time I hear the responses that come from families and just the immediate trust that builds. Kate, let me have you close us out for this part of the conversation and just share a little bit about what you saw with schools that were using talking points during the pandemic, before the pandemic.
Yeah, before the pandemic, we had, well, let's just put it this way, the pandemic lit everything on fire. People needed to communicate, they needed a universally designed way to do that. In a nutshell, the curtain was pulled back for everybody. Families got to see more into what was happening in schools, and schools got to see what was happening with families. That had the opportunity to do something in either, it was a fork in the road. We can either leverage that or not leverage that. Schools that have chosen to leverage that are seeing a shift in culture. Culture eats everything else for breakfast. Once you get that trust built, it creates, I think Gina said it really well. Once you do that, everything gets bigger, better, stronger with the efforts of schools. So on this slide, just the moral imperative and the fiscal imperative have never been better aligned than they are right now. And the sort of serum to it all truthfully is family engagement in a way it never has been before. So we know that this is the answer. All of us on this call, I've just never heard such a chorus coming through from so many people that number one, attendance, 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 attendance before anything else. And number two, family engagement has to be the answer.
I know Hetty Chang is with us, and I know she's super happy that we're talking attendance, attendance, attendance. Ayal, let me bring you into the conversation. Share, if you want to, your reflections from what you heard, but I want also for the folks that are joining us to know and learn more about the resources that Learning Heroes offer schools and districts to strengthen family engagement. And I know you've got a couple of slides to share that information.
Sure, and I'll try to make a connection because Gina referenced a study that RTI and Steve Sheldon led, and it's very compelling. What they found was that when not only when teachers went on home visits, but then the practice of coming back together as a teaching team and reflecting on what they learned about themselves uncovered these questions of bias. It's really, bias is at the heart of a lot of these challenges, and it's really hard to get people to talk about their biases. And so to me, what I especially love about the home visits when I was in the district, this was before Talking Points, but when I was that was some of the best PD I could offer to teachers, because they would go out into the community, they would learn about their families, have all these eye-opening experiences. But what was really tough is that you don't necessarily get those moments where they're back in their grade level meetings and their content level meetings and their staff meetings to actually have those conversations that really start to unearth the really rich, juicy stuff that really helps people start to reflect on their practice and make meaningful shifts over time. So that's some of what we try to do in our work. I think if we can bring up the slides, that would be helpful. We have a number of ways that we support schools. So you heard me talk about research. Research is a really important body of work we do at Learning Heroes. We also have a really important practice body of work. So just a few of them, we train school and systems leaders, principals and district directors and assistant superintendents to build more effective family engagement strategies through our Family Engagement Leadership Institute. We also have an asynchronous teacher PD, which, by the way, to our friends in California, is currently free to all teachers in California. You can write me a note and we can help you get set up. We do public awareness campaigns in local communities and municipalities. And we have a whole suite of teacher and parent resources to help them collaborate more closely together that are free and that are on our website. So I'm just going to say a little bit more about two of these. So you can go to the next slide. First, our institute. The purpose is to fill a gap in teacher and administrator training. Anyone who works in schools knows if the leader doesn't believe or doesn't know, it's just not going to go anywhere. Yoli, we know this. So our goal is to support, our purpose is to support principals and district leaders in leading family engagement strategies that actually impact student learning and well-being. And we have a specific outcome, which is that each participant in our institute concludes the year with a strategy for the following year. So over the course of the year, they try they learn what works, they try some things, and then they come together at the end of the year to design a strategy for the next year. So we can go to the next slide. The way that we do this, well, first they come to some virtual training sessions. This is a national cohort. I have to say, honestly, our virtual trainings are actually very good. We bring a lot of dynamite leaders to talk about what they have tried, what they have learned. There's a lot of breakout time. There's a lot of time for principals to be in community with each other from across the country. So you might have a principal from Miami talking to a principal from Iowa, talking about their strategies. And we also give them time to just work, like quiet time to work during our virtual sessions. We ask them to collaborate with an action team. So they work with a team of staff and families from their school to design new or like iterate on existing initiatives, but also to define what their real challenges are. They get a lot of great coaching. A lot of folks need a lot of support, and our coaching team is fantastic. It's like all current or former principals who have a strong track record in this work, and they produce artifacts of learning, new plans. And like I said, they get plugged into a national network where we bring in scholars and experts. Dr. Mapp joins us on a couple of occasions. So it's really a true leadership network that we have built through the Leadership Institute. And then I'll quickly talk about the next initiative too.
You got 30 seconds.
Okay, well then let's go quick. So you know from my presentation that Learning Heroes is a research organization. One data point that we're really well known for is this finding from our annual nationally representative surveys that 90% of parents in America think their kids are reading or doing math at grade level. This is crazy. The truth is far different than that. So we, in the last spring, we did a public awareness campaign in 6 cities across the country where we drew attention to this in big ways. So you can go to the next slide. So we had big billboards, but we also went into like bus shelters and other more local ways. And our call to action was to ask parents, they may not know that their kids are not performing at grade level, but there were a lot of resources around summer learning and tutoring that were going unfilled despite all the ESSER dollars. So that was our call to action. And so now we have a whole host of cities and municipalities across the country that have asked us to come do campaigns in their local communities too. So we wanted to make sure that folks were aware of all this work that we do on behalf of kids.
Thank
So
you. Thank you, Eyal. It's so wonderful to see the alignment across the work that we all do. Learning Heroes, Talking Points, parent-teacher home visits, Families in Schools, which is the organization I represent. And we're just so aligned, especially on the issues of having real conversations about race and poverty and unpacking that. Because as you said, Eyal, that is at the heart of a lot of what we're challenged with, and gets in the way of sharing power. So, you know, we're thrilled that folks on the call, on the Zoom today are learning about these effective models. We'll continue to share more, but I want to bring our funders back now as we wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so. Steph and Bika, you've heard a lot of powerful and compelling, especially with the research and the data that Learning Heroes with TMTP are doing. They have more work to do, and hopefully they will have the funding that they need. But let's talk about your reflections on what you heard, both from the research that Eyal presented, but also from our program partners, and anything that you would like to add about these models in terms of the why your foundations make the choice to invest in them, and what advice you might offer to funders on the call who might be interested in bringing these models to their communities of focus. Stephanie, you want to start?
Sure. I mean, it's Yoli, I think you said there are wow slides and a wow presentation. It's really hard not to be just incredibly compelled by this data. It's all sort of stuff that we assumed or thought we knew. To see it borne out with statistical analysis is pretty incredible. Kate, you mentioned this, that never before have the moral and fiscal imperative been so aligned. And I think that's really true. I think when you're looking at the chronic absenteeism crisis that is before us, the learning loss crisis that is before us, as a funder, I think we think really critically about how can we use this moment to help close these gaps. Family engagement happens to be an incredibly equitable effort that really does close a lot of critical gaps this way. And so we see this data and feel compelled to invest more. I think it's like we are just scratching the surface here. You hear from Talking Points and parent-teacher home visits, both of which are incredibly established organizations that are reaching a lot of people, but we're still not there. You know, no one solution is going to work for everyone. We need layers and layers and layers of solutions, I should say, with different varying of intensities. Talking Points is a text message. Parent-teacher home visits is a home visit. Those are two incredibly different things that have amazing impact, again, on these critical outcomes that we should all care about. So my reflection is really just like, how can we do more? How can we continue to have these conversations where we're not choosing one model over another, we're not choosing one method over another, but thinking about how all of us work together to ensure that a family's experience, that families feel valued, they feel brought into their child's academic learning journey.
Thank you, Stephanie. And Bika, before you jump in and share your reflections, I just want to give folks a heads up. You're going to see a poll, a survey to respond to while Ambika is sharing her reflections. Don't forget to really take that poll so that you can provide your feedback to Sarah and the team at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on today's webinar. But Ambika, your reflections.
Thanks, Yoli. I wish I could just say +1 to everything Stephanie just said. But really, I think this, just hearing some of this data from Learning Heroes and TNTP was such a reminder. It's sort of, we had this, you know, we knew it was just validation for this work and how important and how critical family engagement is. And we also heard, I think, you know, 2 amazing examples, I would say, of evidence-based practices in family engagement strategies that actually support student success. I mean, with parent-teacher home visit and Talking Points. And as Stephanie said, there are only these two examples but there are dozens of evidence-based practices and interventions that, of family engagement practices that are supporting students and their families. And what I sort of took away from some of this work that was shared, I mean, it's amazing to see that this evidence, it works. We know that it is important. The research shows it. But I find that some of these, whether it's, why doesn't every school district have talking points or parent-teacher home visits? So most of these programs spend precious resources and time to, finding ins with school districts to scale their approaches. And often they have to compete with like better resourced, curriculum providers and other interests that take up district's attention. But I think this data and these programs today that we heard about really show that it's not, it shouldn't, it doesn't have to sit on as a sort of a side on the side. It's how important it is to engage families, and there are programs like these and many others that can actually bridge that gap between home and school and actually support student learning. So thank you for sharing that.
We were very persuaded, absolutely, Ambika, that family engagement is not a nice to have. It is an essential if we want to reach student success for all kids. I know we're close to time. We have answered a lot of questions from our audience online. And I do need to turn it back over to Sarah Torian at the campaign, but there is a question about from Kathy Johnson, wanting to have hard data on the percentages of increase. And then we could provide that in the chat, or Ayal, maybe you could follow up with Kathy Johnson so that I can turn this back to Sarah Torian, my colleague and friend at the campaign, to close us out. Thank you to all of the panelists. What an amazing, amazing session. It was a pleasure and an honor to be your moderator. Sarah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to our amazing panelists. I'm just going to chime in there for joining our chorus, or actually for being the chorus and sharing this great, compelling, and powerful data and examples of effective practices. Thank you to Steph Sharp, to Ambika Kapoor, to Ayal Bergman, to Gina Martinez-Ketty, to Kate Payachek, and special thank you to Yoli Flores for being the perfect person to guide us through this incredible conversation today. Such an important and powerful chorus that you all were sharing with us today, and we need to get more funders, more schools, more districts, more stakeholders singing along with us and understanding the drumbeat of this powerful the impact that family engagement can have on student outcomes. Here's a screen of showing the upcoming sessions. I'd encourage everybody to join us later on this afternoon, 3 p.m. Eastern. We're doing a session in conversation or in partnership with, Attendance Works, looking at chronic absenteeism and the roles that community partners, schools, families, and other stakeholders can engage in to help get more students in their seats every day. We've got a lot of other great sessions coming up in future weeks. I dropped a link in the chat, so please check it out and be sure to join us for more of those. Thank you and have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate it. And it looks like the link to the full report with the data will be shared in the follow-up email for those that have left because of the chat box. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.